Van der Merwe goes to the Sea Point Pavilion. He wants to go for a swim. But at the entrance, the attendant there says, "Sorry, Van der Merwe, you're not allowed in." Van der Merwe says, "But you're letting all these other people in. Why won't you allow me?" He said, "No, Van der Merwe, last time you peed in the pool, so we're not letting you in." Van der Merwe is outraged. He says, "But everybody pees in the pool." The attendant says, "Yes, maybe, Van der Merwe, but they don't all do it from the high diving board." Now that is my favorite joke. I just like it. But it could also be a parable. So what is a parable? It's a little story that has one point. My point was just to entertain and to tell you my favorite joke. But if I was Christ and I was telling a parable, the point of that story could be you can do many sins and make many mistakes, but if you do them publicly and blatantly and obviously, what other people get away with, you're not going to get away with simply because you do it too blatantly. Now, I was trying to think of an example that would illustrate this, and I thought of Martin Shkreli and the Daraprim controversy, where all the big pharma firms in America price gouge. They will charge you if you need an EpiPen or you need insulin. They'll charge you as much as they can, even though it's very cheap to make insulin or, I suppose, adrenaline. But they will charge you 10 times what they charge in other countries, 100 times more than it costs to manufacture, and they'll do it because they can get away with it. And they all do it. And the medical costs in America are astronomical compared to many other countries in the world. And then along in 2015 comes Shkreli and he boasts about it. And he says, "We're raising our prices because we can. We can charge as much as we like to do this." And I think at one stage he was one of, if not America's most hated person for just blatantly saying what he does, whereas all the big pharma companies just do it. They just do it, but they don't boast about it. So I guess you could say there would be an example of it. But I'd like to talk about a very difficult and unknown parable found in my favorite gospel, which is Luke. My least favorite gospel is John. I like Luke because he tells all the little stories which don't get mentioned in the other gospels, like the story of Lazarus and the rich man. Now, do you think there was a actual Lazarus? I don't think so. I think that story in Luke 16 was a parable. Just like, is there a Van der Merwe? Sure, there's many Van der Merwes in South Africa, but Van der Merwe is just the brunt of the joke, just like Paddy is the brunt, or was the brunt of Irish jokes. I haven't heard any Van der Merwe jokes or any Paddy jokes for like decades. I think it went out of fashion, just like I haven't heard a knock-knock joke for many decades. So I think when Christ told the story about Lazarus, he was just choosing a common name of the day, Lazarus. And the rich man isn't given a name, but so Lazarus is, so that we can relate more easily to it. But when you see Lazarus, which is supposedly God's servant, and he's been under the table of the rich man, and the dogs are licking him, and he's eating the crumbs, that doesn't sound like a real story. God's not going to allow his servants to do that, to be that oppressed and just and in such dire straits, but it's a story. It's just like a joke. It's just like my little Van der Merwe joke. It never happened. Van der Merwe never went to the Sea Point Pavilion and was doing things from the high diving board that he shouldn't be doing. No. So this parable in Luke 17 verse 5 onwards is the parable or story of the unworthy servant. Now, I thought long and hard about this. There's only one other parable which mentions an unprofitable servant. I should say unprofitable servant. And that is the parable of the talents, which is related in Matthew 25 and in Luke 19. And, Christ went from town to town to town telling stories, telling these parables, and there's a slight discrepancy between Matthew 25's telling of it and Luke 19's telling of the parable of the talents, probably because in every city that Christ went, I'm a teacher, I've taught the same lesson for 46 years. And every time I tell it, I might modify the lesson, I might tell the same story, but I modify it as it goes along, because sometimes it's just you learn as you go along that this works more effectively to tell the story in this way. So the parables of the talents, people could say, yeah, but they're different. They're slightly different. No, they're more or less the same. But if you realize that a parable is a comparable, it's just comparing something, and it has one point mostly. If you're trying to find multiple points out of it, you're going to misinterpret it. And another thing is parables are told from the point of view of Christ. So you could take the parable of the 99 sheep, and the one sheep gets lost, and the other sheep, and then the shepherd leaves the 99 to go after the one sheep. Now, that parable is told from the point of view of the shepherd being Christ. It's not told from the point of the sheep. The good sheep, the 99, would say, why would you leave us alone to the wolves and that to just go and look for this one naughty Fred? Fred's always getting lost. Fred's always outside there. Leave Fred. Look after us. So the perspective of the parable is from Christ's point of view. Like the parable of the talent, if you look at it from the point of view of the servants, you would say, this master goes away and he's got these high expectations. He comes back, they're not met. And in the one case, he punishes the servants by throwing them into outer darkness where there's gnashing of teeth. And in the other parable, in the same parable of the talents, in either Luke or Matthew, he says, bring these people who don't want me to reign over who don't want me to reign over them, and slay them in front of me. Wow! It's clear what the perspective is. It's not from the perspective of the person who's being slain. These parables are told by Christ. They're told from Christ's perspective, and Christ is a king, and Christ is the Lord who goes away. And likewise, if you read Matthew 17, verse 5 onwards, from the point of view of the servant, you're going to say, my word, this is just terrible. Because the servant, if you read it from the point of view of the servant, you're going to think, this is so unjust. Just like you think the parable of the talents is unjust, that the servant in the parable of the talent just goes and buries his talents and he gives it back to his master. I mean, there's no harm, no foul. The master got back exactly what he gave to the servant. Yeah, but the master says, yeah, but I wanted more. I demand more. I expect more. I expect that the very least you're going to do is go to the bank so that I get a profit. And we, from the point of view of the servant, we might have the servant's mentality and say, but I gave you exactly what you gave me. Why do you claim to be harmed by that? Why are you so outraged? So let's just go and read the parable of the unprofitable servant. So this is towards the end of Christ's ministry that this parable is told, and it's told after Christ has had a confrontation with the Pharisees, and he's about to make his triumphal entrance into Jerusalem, and he tells this parable about 4 days or so before he is crucified. So in Luke 17, verse 5, it says, and the apostles said unto the Lord, increase our faith. And I'm going to skip Luke 17, verse 6, which says, if you have the grain of mustard seed, you will say to this tree, you can be plucked up and thrown into the sea. I don't think it's got anything to do with it. And then it says, now he tells this parable, Luke 17, verse 7. I'm telling you, in answer to their question, it seems like he's just rambling on. But Christ is answering their question about how to increase your faith, the faith of his servants. He says, but which of you, having a servant plowing or feeding cattle, will say unto him by and by, when he is come from the field, go and sit down to meat? And will not rather say to him, make ready wherewith I may sup, and gird yourself and serve me, till I have eaten and drunken, and afterwards you shall eat and drink? Does he thank that servant because he did the things that were commanded him? I trow not. So likewise ye, when you have done all those things which are commanded you, say, we are unprofitable servants. We have done that which was our duty to do. So when Luke 17:10 says, let the servant say to himself, I am an unprofitable servant, it's almost answering and going on from that parable of the talents, where The unprofitable servant is the one who went and buried his talent. And it's the only other place in the Bible where the word for unprofitable servant is mentioned. So I think the two parables actually match up very nicely, even though this is Luke 17 and the parable of the unprofitable servant, it will only be told in Luke 19. So maybe Christ had this on his mind. What is an unprofitable servant? And he tells this parable, and it's a parable. This is not actually happening. So let's just explain in basic terms what Christ is saying. He's saying this master has a servant. Now the servant generally was either a slave or someone who'd gone bankrupt and now had to work off his debt to this master. And it's sort of, you could sort of take it as an employer-employee relationship, but it was, in a sense, the servants can't really get out of what they are doing. So this master has the servant who spends the whole day plowing or feeding cattle, and now when he comes in, he's done a whole day's work. The servant could expect to be served with a meal, but no, instead the master says, clean yourself up, get dressed, serve me my meal first, and then you can go and have your meal. Well, from a servant's point of view, it could be, that's a bit outrageous, Lord. I mean, I've spent a whole day working. Don't I deserve? No, I must now do more and serve you. So the master expects him to serve him, and when he's served, he says, then you can have your food. And he doesn't thank the servant because he does the things which are his duty to do. And then, now Christ says, so likewise you disciples, you who want more faith, when you have done all those things which are commanded you, say, we are unprofitable servants, we have done that which was our duty to do. So doing your duty, just doing your duty, is not good enough. It's not going to build faith. The parable of the talents, you have the servant who is a servant, he's with the other servants, and they each given a number of talents, and they're told to occupy till the Lord comes. And obviously, the person who goes and buries his talent doesn't do very much. He basically occupies space. He occupies a position. He breathes air. He's an oxygen thief. He's a space thief. He's just sitting there like many employees do. They go to the office every day. They clock in. They clock out. And they got very little to show for it. It's almost like you could say, almost all of our politicians in South Africa are like that. They clock in, they clock out, but the country just goes from bad to worse because, oh man, they're so great at making speeches. There's a problem. You'll have your minister there in an instant, and he's promising this. We'll fix the roads. We will solve the unemployment problem. We will get the mines running. We will build you houses. We will. And then he goes home. He clocks out. 10 years later, nothing has happened. And this just happens all the time. So I would say, I'm not blaming. In South Africa, the employees are the same. We have many people who go to work every day. Yes, they're there on time. They occupy space. They're there, but you can get nothing out of them. They do very little. They get paid. If they don't get paid and they don't get raises, yes, we're out there protesting about we want our pay rises. And say we're a miner, we totally object to the mine managers or the mine making a profit. When they're making such huge profits and we're getting nothing, but they are getting something. They're getting jobs and employment, and now so what happens is our mines stand empty and unused, and they're not working, and the workers aren't working because, frankly, they. And I'm saying mining is a terrible job, and I say miners should get paid a lot more, and I say that the masters of the mine should get far less, and CEOs in South Africa get paid terrible amounts of money, like the CEOs of Standard Bank. They get astronomical millions, and the poor teller there gets a tiny amount. So I'm not, please, let's not get diverted. I'm all for the poor getting paid well, and I think it's outrageous that the rich, there's such a huge disparity between the bosses and the workers. But frankly, this parable doesn't care about that. I, if you have adopt that attitude that there shouldn't be such a disparity between the bosses and the workers, you're totally missing the point of the parable. And Christ always speaks from the point of view, he's God, he's king, he's the richest person, and I mean, he owns everything. You can't get richer than God. And by comparison, gee, we poor workers. I mean, by comparison with God, the CEOs in South Africa get big wages. There wouldn't be any comparison because you can't compare infinity with zero. It's just there's no way that mathematically you can even compare God with us. So don't get distracted by that. This is simply saying to make a point. A parable makes one point, and that is, how do you get more faith? Do more than your duty. So, like I will say, like in teaching, I was a teacher for 46 years. If you just clock in, clock out, and you do your job, maybe you do a bit of extramurals, nobody ever thanks you. Nobody, because you're just doing what's your duty. We paid you, we hired you, it's in your contract, you must go and do that. The only time they will ever thank or make a big hoo-ha song and dance and celebrate you is if you have entered a science competition and your kids are doing wonderfully, and you have spent weekends and afternoons and time, huge amounts of time, and you've changed their lives, and they've won this competition, and they're off to Australia to enter the solar challenge or something. So no teacher ever gets celebrated for just doing your job. It's like a poor housewife. She's not a housewife, a woman. She's working, and she does a day's job as a secretary or whatever she does. She comes back. The husband still expects her to feed him and the kids. That's like this poor servant here. And frankly, many wives don't even get celebrated for that. That's like, what? Somebody's got to make food for the kids. And the husband's also out working. He comes home as well. And he considers part of her job to supply him with food before he goes to bed. So does the poor woman get celebrated? No. And again, please don't get distracted. So the woman could say, but I went to work. I should expect when I come home, if I've been to work, and obviously this master's also been to work because he's just come home, someone's got to make the food, and you're it, because you're the servant, and we're it. But let's not be distracted. The point of this is you've got to go above and beyond the normal call of duty if you want to build faith. And in the case of the parable of the talents, what did those people do that built faith? They took their talent or their master's goods, they traded, they sold, they were entrepreneurs, they went and did something that could have lost them their money, or their master's money. And here in both these parables, the parable of the talent and this one in Luke 17, there's some common thread, and that is their attitude towards the master. Because the master's attitude is, you have a certain duty. Don't think when you've done your duty that you've done anything more than was expected of you, because in slaves in those days, their food, they had to work for their food, and it was expected of them. That's not something that they shouldn't expect praise from the master for doing their duty. But the slave could have had their attitude. No, here's the wrong approach. The slave's looking at it from the attitude, I've worked the whole day, I should come home, I shouldn't have to serve this master. You could see there's a bad attitude. And he could think, I've been a profitable servant, but the master's saying, no, you haven't been a profitable servant. And we as modern day snowflake millennial princesses could say, but I should be celebrated. I have done a whole day's work. How dare you expect me to go now make food for you and serve you? Okay, because we have a slightly biased and wrong mentality. And God is saying, don't have that mentality of a snowflake princess. Rather have the mentality that, first of all, you've got to have a good attitude towards your master. Whereas Snowflake Princess could say, this master's terrible. in the parable of the talents. It sounds terrible. You could have a terrible, this master's unreasonable to come, because the servant in the parable of the talents says, I know you, austere man. You reap where you have not sowed. You gather straw where you have not strawed. So in the parable of the talents, the unprofitable servant has a terrible attitude towards the master. He says, the master, you're harsh, you're unfair, you're demanding. And here, likewise, you see in Luke 17, the same attitude is manifest by the servant who thinks, I am profitable, I've done enough. I have done enough. And doing enough is not enough in God's view. If you just do your duty. Now, let's just give you an example in religious terms of what your duty is. The Pharisees were unprofitable servants to Christ. I mean, to God and to Christ. That's why he got rid of the Old Testament, the Old Covenant with Israel, because it was churning out these unprofitable Pharisees. And what did the Pharisees say they did? The Pharisee went up to pray and he says, thank God I'm not like this sinner over here. I fast twice a week. I tithe on my mint and cumin. So what have you done for God by fasting and tithing on your cumin? Does God need your little cumin, your little herbs? No. Does God need your fasting? How is God improved by you fasting? You fast for yourself, buddy, to become a more humble servant. And a more humble servant is one who says, I haven't done anything for God when I just go to church. If you go to church and you're religious and you do all the religious things that you expected to do, you keep the 10 Commandments, you don't lie, you don't commit adultery, you don't steal, you don't covet, you do all those good things. They are good things. You still haven't done a thing for God. You've just done a thing for yourself. You've done your duty. You've done the things that were expected of you. No, a servant of God should not be committing adultery, not be murdering, not be stealing, should have no other gods before God. He's not worshipping idols. Do you expect God to thank you because you don't worship idols? No, I mean, it's crazy. So the Pharisaical attitude was that if they did all those laws, those 613 laws of the Old Testament, and they added a whole lot of human traditions around the Sabbath. For example, you weren't allowed to take up your bed and walk. You weren't allowed to heal on the Sabbath. Where they got that from, it wasn't in the Bible that you can't take up your bed and walk and you can't heal on the Sabbath, but they just built thousands of little man-made laws around the Sabbath to kind of hedge it and protect it, to make sure nobody got ever close to. Don't tear your toilet paper on the Sabbath, because don't press the lift button on the Sabbath. Don't cook on the Sabbath. And it just made the Sabbath into a huge burden. But by doing so, they felt, I've done my duty. And by being a good Pharisee, it didn't make God didn't consider them good people. It didn't make them good people. By doing their duty, they were absolutely unprofitable servants. And the Pharisees, the biggest law keepers, the biggest duty-bound people of that day, were totally useless. And that's why the Israelites had become totally unprofitable servants. And God had to establish a new covenant based on different things. And Christ came and taught the new covenant through things like this parable in Luke 17, verse 7. So at first there appears to be no connection between this story about a man who goes into the field, works all day, then he's expected to come, clean himself up, dress himself, go and serve his master. And even when he's done all that, he must consider himself an unprofitable servant. My word, in the modern day, that's outrageous. This guy's worked overtime and he's still unprofitable. Well, his contract said, many working women do that. They work all day, they come home, they feed the family, they clean the house, they do all those good things. They maybe don't even get thanked for it, and someone's got to do it, and nobody ever comes to you and says, oh, well done. The state just wants to thank you for having raised so many good citizens, so many good children, none of whom went to prison. Does the state thank you because you raise good kids who don't go to prison? And we want to thank you because you've always treated your wife well and you've been an outstanding citizen. No, the state just expects it of you. It's your duty to be a good citizen. They come down on you when you're a bad citizen and they put you in jail. Then you hear all about the state. So where does faith come into it? Faith means you've got to be, like, as I say, in your job. You only get celebrated when you do exceptional things. And to do exceptional things, like, as I say, if you want to be celebrated in a teaching job, you've got to go and win some science fair thing. And that takes a lot of faith, it takes a lot of effort, it takes a lot of running around, getting sponsors, and it can all fail. And your kids could get electrocuted, let's say, or you could, I don't know, your little solar car could crash. So you really have to step out of the box. You have to get away from your duty thinking. And in South Africa too, we South Africa will not make progress while every person just feels that they're doing their duty by going to work. And yet nothing comes from the work. There's nothing profitable that comes from the work. I mean, I was a teacher. Teachers tend to think that they're doing something worthwhile, whereas you might think that if you're a, let's say, a pet psychic, or you're one of those guys who comes up to your windscreen and wants to clean it at the traffic lights, we call them the robots. Oh, we hate those guys. We think they are unprofitable servants. But many of the civil servants who just come in, do their job, they do it badly. Politicians are just a classical example here in South Africa, because there's nothing to show for what they do at the end of the day. There's nothing changed for the better. In fact, it just gets worse. And many of the civil servants, and I mean, the same thing could apply to a private job. If you're just doing a private job and you're just doing the very least, it would be better to get rid of you, make space for somebody who actually beneficiates the organization. It's like you could have a secretary who's got a terrible attitude that the boss doesn't even want to use her. We had a secretary like that at our school. The principal was too scared to get her to come and type. He would always come to me during my free periods and make me type for him. I was his bitch, basically. Excuse the word. I know people hate that, saying that. But I was his little gopher, and he would make me do all the typing for the school because the secretary had a bad attitude towards him and towards work and towards typing, and he kept her on. We had teachers who used to be off every Monday and Friday, and because they had other things they were earning money doing, and the school kept them on, and we had to sit in their classes, and we thought this was totally unjust. So those were like we considered really unprofitable servants, and sometimes I would find that teacher panhandling in the supermarket, like raising money for pets. But you knew that tin of money went straight to him. He just put a label around that tin, and he was panhandling for some sort of his own charity for himself. And he was supposed to be at school on that day, and there was nothing wrong with him. And then he would come just before the exams, teach his kids the answers to the papers, and somehow get away with it. So those are like terrible servants. But that's not what they're talking about. In God's eyes, faith counts a lot. And faith, as far as a servant is concerned, is someone who goes, first of all, you've got to have a great attitude towards your master. You've got to have a great attitude towards your master in the sense that you've got to, if you look at the parable of the talents, they work for him. They're not rewarded with a holiday or a raise. When Christ or the Master returns, he says, have thou rule over 10 cities because you've been faithful over little things. He gives them more work. And he gives them more responsibilities. Nothing about a pay raise or a holiday. And he says, enter into the joy of your Lord in the same parable. So they get approval from their master, more responsibility, more work, no pay raise, no holiday. In a modern sense, just doesn't make sense to us. But I want you to think about it. Do you think at the end of the month the angels come to God for their pay? And he says, Gabriel, here is your pay. And Michael, here's your pay for the month. No, there's no pay in heaven. They've been working for gazillions and billions and trillions and Google numbers of years, and there's no pay at the end of the month. They do it for the approval of the Lord. And when you get to heaven, you're not going to be sitting there doing nothing. You're going to be, what does Christ say? He's going to reward you by making you ruler over 10 cities or a ruler over one city, and etc. So you're going to be rewarded with higher responsibilities, and you're not going to get paid. In heaven, the angels have every need they want met. There's no lack anywhere in heaven, but there's also no pay. So, I think one has to start thinking of these things the way God looks at things. God is the king. He is the master. And, we think the universe still rotates around us, but it rotates around God. In the 1600s, before they found out that the sun was the center of the solar system, we thought that everything in the universe circulated around us. Now, the snowflake princesses of today still think that everything rotates around them. But in God's kingdom, everything rotates around God. And pay is when God smiles at you and says, well done, faithful servant. He doesn't say, here's a raise or take a holiday. He gives you his approbation. And that is what the angels in heaven work for. They work for the approval of God. And every need they have is met. I'm sure they have time off to do their own thing, but they also have duties which they have to perform. And I'm sure that just as faith is valued here on earth, faith is valued there in heaven. And I'm sure that there's some enterprising angels who do go above and beyond the call of duty and come up with things that... Anyway, I ramble on because we're not really told what's going to happen in the future and how the kingdom of heaven is going to be run. But we know that if God is placing such a big emphasis on faith now, and faith means, in the case of, as I say, the parable of the talents, you've got to believe that God's going to reward you. You've got to have a fantastic attitude towards him and believe that even if you fail, he's not going to come down on you like a ton of bricks and jump on you from a dizzy height. He'll forgive you, but just don't have a bad attitude. You say, I'm not going to do anything because I'm so scared, like the Pharisees, that if I do anything and break God's law, God is going to be super annoyed with me. Like if I pull that ox out of the ditch on the Sabbath, the poor animal's lowing there because it's fallen into a ditch, and you don't want to rescue it because you want to be super righteous, or say the Good Samaritan story occurred on the Sabbath, and the Pharisees and the Levite would walk past that. I can't work on the Sabbath and help that person that got hurt on the road. No, I'm off to church. I'm dressed up. I'm dirty. I can't miss church and help this person here. So they had that attitude of God is harsh, and he's just dying to punish and break that Sabbath just a little bit by helping someone on the Sabbath. You could be in big trouble. With that attitude, you're going to be a totally unprofitable to God's servant. Whereas, say, the Samaritan didn't have the same hang-up. He just went and helped the guy and took him to a hotel, and he paid for the hotel let's say it happened on a Sabbath day. He paid the hotel keeper. The Pharisees wouldn't even think of doing that. So sometimes you have to realize that God wants you to exercise faith. Know he's a good God. If you have to break a law or two of God's, like, let's say David even did eating the showbread, or like Rahab the harlot did lying to hide the spies of Israel, God commends that because they're doing it for God. They are exercising great faith. Those people who took the Lord's talents, they could have lost those talents, but they invested them in an investment. Investments can go wrong. The moment you start working with something, it can fail, and they might have lost all of what the goods that the master had given them. They might have failed in their venture. And God says, great, do it. Exercise faith and have a good attitude towards me. So Faith starts with a great attitude towards God, where you're prepared to try something. Even if you fail, you know that God's not going to be against you. He's going to commend you for having tried, and He knows your heart is you trying it for Him. And likewise, we can't just be religious people who just do their duty, who come to church for 40 years and nothing changes. They do nothing. They sit there, they do what's expected, they sing the hymns, they're there, they go home, they have this attitude that they have satisfied the Lord. What have they ever done for the Lord? They're just church goers. They just do the bare minimum, and the Lord is not profited at all by their being at church. So that's to explain my interpretation of Luke 17 verse 5 to 10, the parable of the unprofitable servant. That even if you've done all your religious duty, you must consider yourself an unprofitable servant. And what is a profitable servant? It's one who exercises faith, goes out on a limb for God, has a good attitude that no matter what he does, God's going to reward him for having exercised faith, gone out on a limb to do something actual that will benefit his master, in this case the Lord.